All right, everyone, welcome back to Cheddar Politics coverage of the Iowa caucuses. Results are coming in slowly for the state of Iowa. Right now, we're monitoring some early numbers, very early numbers. We might as well call this the 2% milk update right now because that's just where we're at. We're under 2% of the results that we're going to be expecting throughout the rest of the evening. We've got some numbers that we're going to toss up. Bradley Honan, who's the Democratic pollster and founder and CEO of the Honan Strategy Group, joining us here now. Let's dive right in. In the early themes that we had been tracking coming into tonight, we've already seen Buttigieg do well in some very interesting places in the early polling, in the early caucusing, and then Biden not seemingly doing so well in those same places. What do you make of the storylines right now?
Yeah, and the challenge tonight is that the Democratic Party of Iowa, which is the entity charged with doing the counting, is reporting that they're having pretty substantial, what they call quality control issues, and they are trying to perhaps do a manual count of the data that's coming in. 2 or 3 waves of data coming in from 1,700 precincts across the state, so they must be overwhelmed there. I think one of the storylines tonight is how Joe Biden's electability argument is faring. He ran for president in 1988. He dropped out. He didn't win a single state. He didn't win a single caucus. Same result happened in 2008 when he ran. And so if Joe is not successful tonight, I think it puts a real significant dent in his electability argument. Some of the early numbers that we're seeing, Brad, is not only is Biden not winning the precinct, he's not even reaching the 15% threshold, forcing his supporters and his surrogates to having to go and caucus and realign for other people. So that's a very, very significant problem for Joe Biden if that trend persists past the 2 or 3% margin. We also have, if you want to go to the board, some very interesting results coming out of the college towns.
Let's absolutely go there because we have a graphic showing exactly which counties we're watching, these college towns that are encompassed within there. So let's go to those college towns briefly. What are you seeing there early on?
An interesting one, Johnson County, not Johnston County, which is the footprint of where the University of Iowa is. That's where Bernie Sanders did very, very well against Hillary Clinton in 2016. That's where everybody anticipated he was going to go do well. What we're seeing in the early results out of 2 precincts is that it's actually Elizabeth Warren who's doing particularly well there. So the Bernie message isn't connecting as well as it did 4 years ago, and she's running up some fairly substantial numbers there. Iowa City, where the University of Iowa is. If we go to the center of the state in Polk County, not a state university, but something called Drake University. Again, that should be an area where Bernie does well. Warren is driving the vote very substantially there. She's 212 votes there versus Sanders, who's at 129. Biden's only at about 130.
And this is around that epicenter of Iowa in Des Moines as well, where you're seeing a lot of the business really accumulate towards, and that's where perhaps we'll get the best inclination because of the urbanization as well of what may take place in other states. What about in manufacturing particularly also? 3 big counties that we're keeping an eye on throughout the evening.
So that's where I think you mentioned before, Mayor Pete is doing surprisingly well in some of those more conservative, maybe even moderate counties where he's pulling in a lot more of the vote, maybe that would have otherwise have gone to Biden. And what we're seeing with some of the early second choice realignments, as it's called in those eastern counties, is that the second choice is going to Mayor Pete rather than Biden, and that's causing him to have a big increase in his share of the vote.
Absolutely, and we're showing some breaking news across the bottom as well. We've got continuous numbers that we're going to be showing our viewers throughout the rest of the evening, especially with the realignment that is going to be taking place at several of these sites as well. Democratic officials are doing some quality control, as you mentioned. Just what does that mean? Can you break that down for us again? Quality control, what would constitute of needing quality control? Why would we get to that point in this particular evening in the caucusing?
4 years ago, there were a lot of problems with the data that was coming in. So what happens, Brad, is the initial vote takes place, and then if the particular candidates aren't reaching that 15% threshold, the caucusers are forced to realign in favor of another candidate. What happened 4 years ago is that initial vote, that initial alignment was not reported out. And the Sanders campaign in particular was very critical of the state party. So what the state party said is, we are going to build an app. We're going to release twice as much data. The app doesn't appear to be working well, and so they're probably doing a manual recount that's twice as hard as they did last time, because they've added another wave of data that they want to report publicly.
Would you expect any change in the numbers that we're early seeing right now because of this manual count? Would there be any change at all, or would that slow down the process to the point where it would actually delay the data and when we get it eventually?
I think it could potentially be a very long evening ahead of us. It could break, but I think it's going to be a long evening. I mean, we haven't seen really any data out of the western portion. That's the agricultural part of the state. That's older, that's conservative. Biden's not doing well because the 2% is not necessarily coming from his base. Once we start getting data from those other parts of the state that haven't been represented in that 2%, I think the storyline could change. So I think it's going to be a long evening here as we try and get data, which may be quite literally being manually counted paper by paper at this point in headquarters at Des Moines.
Now, in the early counties that we've seen even Pete Buttigieg do well in, or Sanders do well in, is there a belief that they could actually compete well? And this big word that we've heard getting tossed out all night, electability. Is there electability in those particular counties? Could they campaign against and win against Trump in those counties?
I think that's going to be one of the central arguments if those two candidates are going to prevail tonight. I think Mayor Pete is going to say that he's much more moderate. He represents more moderate voters and has apparently in this early count done very well with them. I think Sanders is going to have a much harder argument to make. I think Mayor Pete is going to say, I can persuade people to come back to the Democratic franchise, and Sanders is much more about mobilizing people to come into the caucus. And I think some of the early indications are that we do have a much larger turnout than we have seen historically, maybe even record-setting tonight, which again only compounds the problems of counting more and more paper ballots in headquarters in Des Moines.
You've been breaking down the quality control issue for us. I want to show a tweet that we have as well from a BuzzFeed reporter saying there is a technical issue with Iowa results reporting, hearing from multiple campaigns that the Iowa Democratic Party is sending a tech staffer to the shared boiler room in Des Moines, where the campaigns have staff headquartered to brief them momentarily on what's going on. What do you make of this, given that you've been monitoring going into this quality control issue, now knowing that there is this effort to try and alert campaigns of exactly what is taking place?
So this is where they are trying to put in a solution to what took place 4 years ago, and it's blowing up in their face. And we're going to be looking, Brad, at the sausage making process, which isn't pretty with the recount. There are also stories, and this has happened before, of tie between two different candidates where they're literally flipping a coin to determine who the winner is in these individual precincts.
Are you surprised by the amount of coin flips? Have we seen a good number of coin tosses thus far?
We've seen more than we've traditionally seen in the past. That seems to be going up, and it's just a very peculiar process. Social media, which we talked about earlier, is beginning to cause a lot of people to again re-ask the question. It's not particularly representative. The process is flawed, and we've gone from bad potentially to worse depending upon how the evening is going to play out. I think there's going to be some conversation about whether this process was fair, whether this process was rigged, which people on Twitter are starting to talk about, and whether the actual winner that the state party is going to announce actually has firmness to it and has credibility given some of the problems that we're hearing about. And that's not a particularly good outcome for Democrats tonight when the party's looking for consensus and alignment about who is the right standard bearer to take on Donald Trump.
All right, sports fans have Mike and Mike in the morning, but politics fans have Brad and Brad in the evening. We're going to continue breaking down the Iowa caucuses here. Bradley Honan's going to stick around, Democratic pollster, founder and CEO of the Honan Strategy Group. Stick around. More coverage of the Iowa caucuses coming up.